ตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะนะโมตัสสะภะคะวะโตอะระหะโตสัมมาสัมพุทธัสสะพุทธังธัมมังสังฆังนัมมัสสามิ Blessings, good evening to you all, or good afternoon if you're in other parts of the world. We always recommend for Buddhist practitioners to have a daily practice of one sort or another. That could include practice of meditation on a daily basis, chanting perhaps, reflections, suttas, and listening to Dhamma as well. How much one does, what amount of each one of those one does varies from person to person. But if you have a regular practice, it's helping your mind to come back to the path of practice, to the Buddha Dhamma Sangha, to the way of practice at least once a day. And through repeated practice and a repeated regular practice, that develops a certain continuity of effort, and certain good qualities keep arising in your mind because of that regular practice. And one thing that for me and for many others, many of you I think, happens is if you keep practicing regularly, you get a great sense of gratitude and appreciation for the Buddha and his teachings, because if you keep hearing them, reflecting on them, and practicing them, and you can't help but appreciate the depth of the Buddha's wisdom and how much benefit these teachings are giving you, even if it can be very hard and difficult or challenging sometimes to practice what the Buddha taught. You get a sense of appreciation for his great wisdom, and also for the Sangha, and particularly living Sangha or from Sangha from our lifetime, so such as teachers such as Ajahn Chah. If you keep coming back to your practice, you get this sense of appreciation of the Buddha, the qualities of the Buddha, the Dhamma, the depth of the Dhamma, the explanations of the truth, the teachings that he gave. And then the Sangha, those who have embodied those truths in their practice, then shared them with us. And these feelings of gratitude and appreciation are very nourishing to the mind, and they're very natural. And maybe, perhaps you could say that because of the depth of the wisdom of the Buddha, there's so many different aspects of truth that he pointed out and explained and guided us towards. The more you practice, the more you hear the Dhamma, the more you practice it, you probably find the more that sense of appreciation grows. And then it becomes more of an internal refuge for you that you can take with you wherever you go. So even though we may have our particular favorite place or most suitable place of practice, such as a monastery, temple, Buddhist center, or just a room in our home perhaps, a shrine, if you have this regular practice that you keep returning to, well, even if you're traveling for business or family matters or recreation, whatever, even when you're traveling, you take this refuge with you and you can take the practice with you. So it's as if a little bit of the Buddha Dhamma Sangha goes with you wherever you go. I was just in Thailand last week and spent a few days with Lumpur Sumedho, and we were reminiscing about life, because he's lived a long and full life as a monk, and he's practiced in many different countries, in many different situations. And we were talking about, where's the best place to practice? Because obviously there are places that are more suitable than others, or that we feel is more convenient to practice than others. But we agreed in the end that the real place of practice is here in your heart, wherever you are. That's the place of practice, what you might call the inner refuge. But to develop this inner refuge, or this feeling of having an inner refuge, you also need to use the externals. So the place helps, people associating with other Buddhist practitioners can help. And then some of these practices that we do, the meditation, the chanting, the listening to Dhamma, when you practice repeatedly, some of that comes within your own thinking, your own mind, and then it becomes part of your inner refuge. And you can chant anywhere. I had a young mother at the monastery today saying she wanted to practice chanting, but she's got a baby and she doesn't want to wake her baby up. So I said, well, just chant softly. You can chant softly or loudly. The chanting is a practice of mindfulness, focusing on the words. Also brings up faith, also brings up wisdom when you chant. But whether you chant with a loud voice, a loud sound, or a soft sound, doesn't matter. The important thing is to do it sincerely. So we can actually be quite flexible in how we practice. You can chant at home even with a young baby there, or as you're driving your car. Some people think, well, it's maybe disrespectful to chant Buddhist reflections as you drive your car, but if it helps you to be mindful, why not? And that's one of the purposes of chanting, is to bring your attention to the present moment and give your mind something to focus on, just as we focus on the breath or any other meditation technique. You can chant as you walk down the road. You can chant, anywhere, anytime, really, more or less. And the practice of Dhamma is like that. You can reflect on the Dhamma. You can bring up reflections, the truth, anytime. You can practice mindfulness in any posture. And this is one of the amazing things about practicing the Buddha's teachings. They're not limited to time and place. We say they're akaliko. And that gives you an amazing scope, opportunity to practice anytime, anywhere. And we also have a framework or a structure. So like the more I practice, the more I find the Four Noble Truths an amazing kind of reflection that you can use at any time, in any situation in your life. And that's how they're supposed to be used. They're like guidelines to how to reflect or look at your life and your experience to understand it better, with a purpose. That is the end of stress, the end of suffering. That's another part of the practice here. How do you apply the Four Noble Truths in your daily life when you're going about your business? So it's something to keep coming back to, remind yourself of. That's why we listen to the Dhamma regularly, and then also just reflecting on the Dhamma. First Noble Truth, dukkha. What does dukkha mean to you? It's obviously a word. It's not an English word if you're an English speaker or whatever your native language is. First of all, you just have to establish an understanding. What does dukkha mean? And the Buddha talked about many different kinds of dukkha. There's pain, physical pain is dukkha. And there's mental discontent is probably a very broad term that's very covers many aspects of life. We have discontent or dissatisfaction arise in our mind. We have physical pain, we have mental discontent, discomfort. But then also we have the sort of deeper kinds of dukkha, things like the fact that everything is constantly changing and arising and passing away and breaking up. And that's why we need to find this inner refuge through our practice. Because if you take refuge in the world out there, the material world, or even your body, you quickly become disappointed because it's constantly changing and arising, passing away, and is very unreliable. But in terms of Dhamma, that's dukkha. That's something that the Buddha said we have to get to know. So dukkha, the first noble truth, the Buddha said, dukkha is to be known, to be recognized, to be understood. So when he taught the Four Noble Truths, and he sort of gave this framework that we can use for reflecting on our daily experience, he talked about the Four Noble Truths in their 3 phases, their 12 aspects. So for dukkha, there is dukkha. He made this statement, there is dukkha, there is suffering, there is pain, there's discontent. It's an experience which happens. And I think we're all familiar with that now because we've been practicing for a while. So there is dukkha. That's the first step, is just noticing or becoming aware of that fact. Then there's the instruction from the Buddha, dukkha is to be known, which is like the second phase. And then dukkha has been known. There's enough awareness in the mind to know this is dukkha, it's like this. The dukkha has been known. There's on these 3 levels that all the Four Noble Truths are to be contemplated and used in our experience. So, dukkha, suffering, stress, it's there, it's to be known, and it has been known. When we've applied our mind to it, we've cultivated this Buddhist path, the Eightfold Path, then we can know dukkha as dukkha. When we're mindful, when we're aware, we can know dukkha as dukkha. What's the opposite? When we don't have awareness, understanding, wisdom, we tend to just react. So we're not applying the Four Noble Truths when we just react, do we? So for example, you have a pain while you're sitting here, just as you're sitting listening to me talking, you might have pain in your back or your leg. If you're aware enough, you can know, oh, there's this painful feeling, and you just know it as pain. And you say, oh, this is part of the dukkha of having a human body. We get pain. So that's like knowing dukkha. There is dukkha, it's to be known, and I know it. It's just this pain. But when we lose our mindfulness and our understanding and the wisdom slips away, then dukkha becomes me, it becomes self. Self-view becomes craving and attachment, doesn't it? It stimulates that. So you have a pain and then you react to it. I don't like this pain, I don't want this pain, or we move. And at that moment we're no longer with the noble truth of dukkha. The mind has gone into its reaction, and that's craving and attachment, which is the cause of more dukkha. But it's our habit to do that. When we're not very mindful, the slightest bit of mental discontent or physical discomfort or pain stimulates more dukkha, more pain, unless we are applying the Four Noble Truths and the path of practice at that moment. And it's just the way it is, but it's something it starts to become more obvious, more apparent as we practice this Buddhist path. Craving and attachment are the cause of dukkha, so they're the second noble truth. So there is a cause to this dukkha, this pain. It's called craving and attachment. Actually, it's unawareness, it's ignorance is the beginning. That maybe is more obvious. It's pretty obvious when we're not aware, we don't know, we don't understand, we're not mindful, then the mind is no longer seeing or experiencing the Four Noble Truths. It's lost, so it falls into craving and attachment. So it's fairly kind of easy to understand that unawareness or lack of knowledge of the Four Noble Truths is the beginning point of the cause of suffering. But what does it mean in practice, in daily life? Well, we all know when you lose your mindfulness, whether it's during your meditation or just going about your business, when you lose your mindfulness, you get caught into these reactions of craving and attachment over and over again. They're like old friends, even though they're friends that hurt us, we are so familiar with them, they're like old buddies that we're used to. There's the old buddy of craving, so it's 3 types of craving. It's craving for sense objects. You're constantly reacting with pleasure and pain or aversion and attraction for different sense objects, sight, sound, taste, smell, touch. And then craving to become, so you want things, you want to be a certain way, you want your life to be a certain way. Craving not to become. There's certain experiences, certain ways things are that you don't want to have, don't want to experience, don't want to be. So these 3 kinds of craving, these are the cause of dukkha, the cause of suffering, and they're to be abandoned. But to abandon them, we have to press on and understand the other aspects of the Four Noble Truths. Because to abandon craving, you need to have enough mindfulness and understanding and wisdom to do that. And that comes under the 4th Noble Truth, the path that's to be cultivated and has been cultivated. So craving is the cause of suffering, it's to be abandoned. When we've practiced well enough, we'll be able to abandon it completely. But even in the short space of a meditation period or just a period when you're trying to bring up mindfulness, you can abandon some craving in that moment. When you notice your reaction to what other people say or what's going on in your life at that moment, if you notice craving any time, that's the arising of Magga, the 4th Noble Truth. You say, oh, I'm under the influence now, under the influence of craving. But it's the 4th Noble Truth coming to bear on the 2nd Noble Truth. I say, oh, this is craving, this is what I have to give up, let go of, relinquish. And you have this amazing teaching that we can come back to over and over again through our life, through our day. When you notice yourself getting stressed, and perhaps not at the beginning of a train of thought that's an expression of your stress or suffering, but after a while you'll notice, oh, I'm really uptight here, or I'm angry, or I'm worried. Finally, when a bit of mindfulness starts to arise, then you can put the 2nd Noble Truth into action and say, well, this is what I have to let go of. This stressful state, the worry, the agitation, the discontent. And as you establish mindfulness, you're doing that. You're actually putting the 4 Noble Truths into practice in that moment. How well we do it, well, depends on many factors. How long we've been practicing, how sincere, how much effort we put in, all kinds of different factors. And some kinds of craving are harder to let go of than others. Some small cravings we may be familiar with and we know how to let go of them. Others, we're still a bit overwhelmed by them. So we have to tread carefully. But still, the practice is the practice. And if you're encountering some suffering, then there'll be craving not far away. The 4th Noble Truth then is cultivating this path, learning to bring up awareness, effort, understanding, wisdom, all the different qualities of the path, and bringing it to bear on our craving and attachment. to start this process of relinquishing or abandoning craving, little by little, undermining it, letting it go. And sometimes we experience success when the mind becomes really calm and content. You may have a good physical feeling come up and good mental feeling come up. And we call that nirodha. It may not be the complete cessation of suffering yet, but it's a taste of it. When you've had some craving bothering you, something was really bothering you, or you were upset about something, you were thinking over and over again, reacting to something, maybe, or you're having some desire that was just bugging you. You really had a desire for something you want, and it was bugging you over and over again, but you finally get enough mindfulness to say, no, this is to be abandoned, this is just more suffering, I'm going to let it go. And you do that. Then that's like the third noble truth in practice, letting go of that desire, that reaction, the disappointments, the highs, the lows, the attachment to them and the identification with them is like a small period of nirodha. And you experience some peace from it. And that's why we do it. And that's the purpose of the practice, is these four noble truths bring your mind to experience, at least temporarily and in small ways or sometimes bigger ways, the abandoning of craving and the space in the mind that comes from that. Because if you abandon craving and attachment, then that's like a big chunk of your mental activity stops, if only for a while. The cynic, the sort of negative person will say, well, it's going to come back again. And true, it may come back, but at least you can appreciate those moments where your craving goes quiet because you've seen it and let it go. We call that the spaciousness of the mind, or the emptiness of the mind. And Buddhists often ask this question. They say, oh, what is the empty mind? Where's the mind that is free from craving and attachment? But it's not like there's nothing there. In order to experience the empty mind, craving and attachment going, you have to have cultivated the fourth noble truth, the path. So all these other qualities are there. Sila, samadhi, mindfulness, samadhi and panya, wisdom and understanding are there. But they're kind of silent. They're like silent friends who are just there facilitating the letting go of craving. But they actually manifest as the mind that has gone still, quiet, free from craving, if only for a while. So, nirodha is the result of magga. Dukkha, stress and suffering, is the result of samudaya, the second noble truth, craving and attachment. So they're kind of like opposites. When we follow craving and attachment, we get more dukkha. When we follow magga and we cultivate it and develop it, we get nirodha. Very simple kind of logical system for reflecting on your daily mental activity and your actions and what's going on in your life. And at any time you can ask yourself, as I'm doing this thing, as I'm at this moment in my day, in my life, am I cultivating the path for nirodha, or am I following craving and attachment for more dukkha? And it's a very simple question that you can bring up, and that you might say that's the establishing of mindfulness, clear comprehension, understanding of what's going on at any moment. Actually bringing the Four Noble Truths to bear on your experience at any moment, and you can do that. So, of course, it takes that ability of introspection, turning your attention inwards to examine your own mind a bit more closely. And that's why we cultivate mindfulness, that's why we listen to the Dhamma, reflect on it, bring up the mindfulness over and over again. But it's a very simple question you can ask. At any one moment, is this Is this the second noble truth leading to the first noble truth, craving leading to dukkha, to suffering? Or is this the fourth noble truth leading to the third noble truth of cessation? And sometimes we get it right, and sometimes we get it wrong. It's one of the more common questions we get in the monastery, is people often ask, how can you separate between craving, what you might call unwholesome desire that leads to suffering, and then magga, which you might call wholesome or skillful desire, which leads to the end of suffering? Because some people misunderstand. They say, well, in order to experience the end of suffering, you have to get rid of all desire, all thought, all desire, all wanting from the mind. But really, the first step is more you have to know the difference between these two. Know the difference between the skillful desire of the path, which is something you have to cultivate. Because you've had faith in the Buddha, you've heard the teachings, you're kind of energized and motivated to practice. You do need to put effort into cultivating this path, and that putting effort in is what we call skillful desire, what they call kusala chanda, the desire to cultivate the path, wholesome dhammas, skillful dhammas, for the end of suffering. It doesn't come out of nowhere, it has its causes, and the causes are your skillful desire, bringing that up, developing that. But the unskillful, unwholesome desire of craving is to be abandoned. So the Buddha himself, he said a lot of his time pre-Buddha, pre-enlightenment, was spent working out which is which. Which is wholesome desire that leads on to skillful action, cultivating the path for the end of suffering, and which is unskillful desire, which always leads to more suffering, which is not what we want. And you'll notice even when you meditate, your mind sometimes is alternating between the two. They're kind of going back and forth. And so, many meditators tell us how, I get so tense when I'm meditating. I thought I would meditate to, free my mind from stress, tension, to make my mind peaceful, happy. And yes, you are, but if you're becoming more tense, then something is not quite right. And usually it's the unskillful types of desire slipping in, aren't they? We start to practice with negative desires. Often it's wanting results, wanting something, some special experience, or wanting a mind free from desire is another kind of desire. It's just we don't recognize it at first. So sometimes when we're practicing, you kind of have to work backwards. So say you're meditating and you're not yet very peaceful and not very at ease, you are experiencing discontent. You have to work backwards and say, what am I getting wrong here? Where am I going wrong in my thinking? Maybe there is something that I'm not doing quite right, and you have to keep looking and recognizing what's going on. And it may be that craving for peace, the end of suffering, that in itself is an obstacle. And often it's recognizing that at that moment when you recognize the very craving for peace or for results is obstructing your mind or bringing you tension. It's when you recognize that and you start to relax and let it go that you experience the very peace you were wanting. Because you can't gain peace by wanting it. It's not enough. It's not the right way to go about it. It actually is throwing up obstacles in your mind the whole time. The very wanting agitates the mind, creates more discontent, dissatisfaction. But then we have a problem because you say, well, if you don't want peace, you let go of the wanting, well, what motivates you? Well, it's learning the difference between the two kinds of desire, and this is, you might call this wisdom or panya. And wisdom is where you recognize craving, as the cause of suffering. And you say, oh, this is what I need to abandon. Recognizing that any kind of stress and suffering is always, not what we want. Nobody wants to suffer. It's not good, it's not pleasant. And working the way back to the source and say, where's the craving here? Where am I going wrong in my thinking? Where am I holding on? And starting to put down that way of thinking, let it go, give it up from the mind. Putting down the burden, we call it sometimes. Because it is a burden. If you keep holding on to craving, it's a burden. And it's heavy and it's unpleasant. You have to keep looking and recognizing where the craving is slipping in, even when you're meditating and you might assume you're doing something good, but that assumption is not enough. You also have to look more carefully. Perhaps you have to sort of observe your mind, the state of mind behind your action as you're meditating, and try and unearth or reveal to yourself where craving may be slipping into your thinking as you meditate. And the telltale signs are you're still tense, you're still discontent or getting annoyed with yourself. We all know what it's like when you're thinking too much. You're upset, you're angry, you're irritated because your mind is not peaceful. So we're piling on the craving, piling on the suffering at the very moment when we're hoping for peace. And we often undermine our own efforts because we're slipping into craving even as we meditate. And it happens in every aspect of the practice. Like sometimes it's in other ways, like we have a craving for knowledge. Because we know the Buddha said when you have true knowledge of the Four Noble Truths, well, your suffering will subside, you'll experience true peace or the emptiness of the mind. So then people say, I want knowledge. But they tend to come back to the more worldly approach. So they say, well, I must read more or listen to more Dhamma. So I know one monk who, he spent 1 year just reading and reading all the Buddhist texts, which in one sense is quite a good thing to do. It's not necessarily all wrong, but because he was doing it with a lot of craving, he really couldn't meditate at all. He couldn't sit still at all, because he was obsessed with reading to gain knowledge of the Buddhist texts. And he thought that would be the way he would realize these Four Noble Truths. But after a year or so doing that, he realized, oh, this is just gaining more information, and sometimes it got a bit confusing, piling more and more information, one level on top of another level, you might say, to the point where he said, oh, I think I need to change my approach. And I agreed. So he stopped reading for a while, and he said it was really hard. It was almost like, a drug addict coming off the drugs. He had withdrawal symptoms. You see a book and there's a desire to pick up the book. And then he said, no, I've got to leave it. I've got to give it a rest. So even something like reading Dhamma can become a bit of an addiction and an obstacle. I'm not saying it's always the case, but in this person's case it was. So he had to learn to set aside the books. And he had plenty of knowledge he'd gained from the books, and then he had to turn that awareness inwards and just learn from his experience. Or when people practice, kindness and generosity, they also can, this craving, the unwholesome craving, looking for results, looking for something special, can slip in. And we know that as well, the sense of self that comes in when you do a good deed, you're kind to someone, or you practice some generosity or charity, or help somebody, or do some volunteering or something. You do it, but then the craving slips in. You say, I want recognition for this, I want people to see, or I want some special reward, I want to feel good, or I'm hoping for next life to get some special heavenly reward or whatever. It can manifest in different ways, but it's that sense of self that slips into the good action that we're doing. And it can feed our conceit, can feed our sense of self, what we call conceit or attachment to personality view, self-view. So even as you're doing good, like helping other people, then you still have a pride or a conceit in what you're doing. So if someone else comes along and criticizes you, you get annoyed or upset. Or if you're doing something good, like helping others, or being kind, generous, but someone next to you is not, you get angry with them because they're not doing as much as you, perhaps. This is going back to craving and attachment slipping into your thinking even as you're doing something good. And it can also happen with precepts. You keep precepts, 5 precepts, 8 precepts, or if you're a monk, you're following the Vinaya, the rules of discipline. And then the next person is not, or they're not doing it as well as you. And if you're not careful, the unwholesome kind of craving and desire, the second noble truth, slips into your thinking. So maybe you keep a precept very well and then the person next to you doesn't, so you start looking down on them. And the Buddha pointed out, if that happens, you're actually more foolish than them. Because you know what you're doing, you're keeping precepts, you recognize maybe someone else is not keeping a precept or not keeping it as well, as fully as you. But then you look down on them, you fall into another kind of craving, so you're actually more foolish than them. Double suffering. So these 4 noble truths literally can be used at every stage of the practice. You say you are what we call a non-returner, an anagami practicing for arahant. You're on the very final stage of your Dhamma practice, your path that you've been developing for years and years and lifetimes, and you're just very close to Nibbana. You still have to reflect on these 4 noble truths. It's not like they're sort of kindergarten Dhamma teaching, you learn what they are. There's suffering, craving is the cause of suffering, Nirodha is the end of suffering, Magga is the path, I know that, I know the 4 noble truths, now I'll move on to the more refined, higher Dhamma. It's not actually like that. They form a framework that you take with you from your starting point, which is now, up to Nibbana, which is the end point maybe of the practice. You take them with you as a kind of a guide, a basis for reflection, for understanding your experience at every level of Dhamma practice. Whether you're working with a very refined states of consciousness, the states of samadhi and deep insight, or the more basic stuff, just getting annoyed with your neighbour. It doesn't really matter. You use the 4 noble truths at every level, at every stage. So they're useful. They're always useful. They're all encompassing of the whole of the Buddhist path from A to Z, beginning to finish. That's why the Buddha said, they're like the elephant's footprint and all the other footprints of the animals fit into. It's just, as you progress in the practice, maybe some of these cravings and attachments that block us or obstruct us become more subtle, more refined. So you have to use a more refined awareness and understanding of the Noble Truths. But the actual framework remains the same. There is some subtle conceit, craving, attachment that you're still falling prey to, falling into, obstructing your mind from liberation and freedom from suffering, Nirodha, and you just haven't seen it yet, so you have to keep reflecting, establish ever more subtle mindfulness, awareness and wisdom. So you use the same framework at every level, whether you're a beginner, intermediate, refined, top-level practitioner. They're always useful. And the anagami has still got subtle attachment to a sense of conceit. It's one of the last of the 10 fetters that the anagami abandons. So that sense of conceit, being different or comparing oneself to others. They're higher than me, the same as me, lower than me. On the most subtlest level, the sense of me, I am a self, a me, mine, myself. Sometimes people say, I thought you let go of the sense of self when you become Sotapanna, the first level of enlightenment. Well, it's a coarser sense of self, the view of self, what we call Sakkaya Ditthi, self-view. And that's, the most troublesome because it causes us in all kinds of disappointments, unhappiness, always comparing ourselves with others, and also, getting angry, upset, what we call a sense of ego that comes up in all kinds of situations, arguing over views and opinions, getting angry, falling into greed and attachment. We all know that, the coarsest manifestations of self, what monks tend to call ditthimana. It's one of Ajahn Chah's favourite topics for reflection. Where is the ditthimana? That's where the suffering is coming from. Attachment to your view, your opinion on something. I know best, better than you, that kind of thing. But even an anagami, a very advanced practitioner who already has experience of the jhanas, has let go of the body and has the most subtlest states of mind, they still have a very subtle conceit, still there. The Buddha said it's like the fragrance of the flower. The flower has been removed, but the fragrance still fills the air. So there's nothing there anymore, but the fragrance is there. Fragrance is made up of tiny molecules of scent, but there's something there. That's like the conceit of the anagami. So it's a very subtle sense of self compared to even the Sotapanna, and certainly compared with the unenlightened person. But the same remedy is applied. This subtle sense of conceit is seen as impermanent, as not self, as a cause of suffering. If you attach even to the fragrance of the flower, you're going to suffer when you don't get it or it doesn't last, when you lose that fragrance. So even the anagami has the most subtlest suffering, agitation of mind. But the Four Noble Truths are the remedy, where we're on basic level, intermediate level, superior, refined level. Four Noble Truths work at every level of this practice. So that's why it's worth investing in getting in the habit of using them to reflect on your experience. So whether you're stuck in traffic, getting frustrated with the other drivers, you use the Four Noble Truths. When you're waving your fists or you're complaining, whether you're complaining under your breath or you're shouting out loud, at that moment you have to stop and say, which of the Noble Truths is this? Oh, this is samudaya, the second Noble Truth, giving into my craving. Maybe you have craving not to become. You want to become somebody who's not caught in traffic. So you have craving not to become, to get away from this situation where you are caught into traffic. But you apply that reflection, don't you? Oh, this is the second Noble Truth here, craving and attachment. What's to be done with that? It should be abandoned. So instead of pursuing your angry state of mind because you're caught in traffic, you let it go. And you can realize a little bit of nirodha there. Or if you're deeply absorbed into a really refined state of mindfulness and samadhi, you're no longer in a traffic jam, but in a nice state of samadhi, but you have a subtle sense of self forming around the pleasure of that samadhi. Well, you apply the same Four Noble Truths. Where's the craving and attachment here? Maybe it's attachment to the bliss, to the emptiness of mind, the feeling of peace. That's where your attachment lies, in that situation. But the same Four Noble Truths apply. So it's never a waste of time to reflect on the Four Noble Truths. And our aim, you could say, is to get to the point where the Four Noble Truths are just there all the time, your inner refuge. As we say, one who sees the Dhamma sees the Buddha. One who sees the Buddha sees the Dhamma. So I'll leave you with those reflections tonight, and if anyone has any questions, we'll have a chance for that afterwards.